Hi, this is Superintendent Mike Morris. Thank you so much for being with us at this evening coffee hour. I'll introduce our guests in a moment, but I just want to thank the community for the continued feedback. We know this is a challenging time, especially as the sun is going down quite a bit earlier, and as the weather turns quite a bit colder. Last week we had the nice reprieve, but unfortunately I don't think we'll have that again for a while. We really want to do sessions, and this is the first of hopefully a series where we can communicate, collaborate, and share ideas and thoughts about how to support our students through the winter months, through this COVID winter, as it's being called. So tonight we'll have two guest presenters. We're going to talk for probably 20 minutes, and then we really wanted to open up for more interactive dialogue and question and answer, so we can make sure we're addressing the questions that you all have. So with that, I'll introduce Courtney and Sarah, and they're here today, and they work with us through our association with the BRYT program, which we have at our middle school and high school, but they work with many different districts in the area, and they're really, I find, very helpful in thinking about this. So I'm part facilitator, but mostly listener, and I may come up with my own questions as we go through it because this is such an important topic for us as we head into the winter. So Courtney and Sarah, thank you for joining us. We really appreciate you being here this evening and making time in your busy schedule for our community. But why don't I let you introduce yourself, and then you can get started with just some initial thoughts that you want to share.
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Sarah Rigney. I'm a licensed clinical social worker. I live over in Florence. So I'm just across the river from many of you. And I just want to say, in addition to being a mental health clinician for over a decade now, I'm also a parent to 7-year-old twins who are also in remote schooling. And so I'm wearing a few different hats tonight as a clinician, as a parent, and as someone who's also kind of pretty heavily involved with schools. Courtney?
Hi, I'm Courtney Tucker. I'm also a licensed clinical social worker. I am actually in Northampton, Massachusetts. And today we're going to be talking to you about, what exactly are we going to be working through? What happens now as it gets dark, as it gets cold? How can we prioritize wellness in the midst of experiencing more uncertainty, more darkness almost, and more lack of connection? Like, this lack of connection has gone on for so long. The other thing is BRYT is Building Resilient Youth in Transition. And what it is a bridge program that helps students stay in school after they've experienced some sort of mental health crisis. So it actually provides a transition or a bridge program so that students are able to gradually integrate successfully back into the school.
So we're super happy to be joining you tonight. I know Mike said that we would talk for a little while. I want to let folks know that both Courtney and I are really actually super interested to hear from you. And it can be any of the questions you have. It can be things that you're observing in your children and maybe you don't know what to make of them. But really, we're here to kind of be with you in your journey and answer what questions we have, give resources, make suggestions, talk through any questions or concerns you have. Because what's happening for our kids these days is really significant. Even for our youngest ones who may not fully understand everything that's going on, the impact of being out of school is a significant change in their lives. And it's a significant change in ours as parents and adults who are close to them. So, we invite your questions and really hope that you'll engage with us by asking, talking to us about what thoughts you're having at this point in time. Courtney, anything that you would want to add in terms of other things that we are going to be able to cover tonight?
So I kind of want to set the context a little bit about what everyone and what we're experiencing right now is, I think that initially we would say that we were in the midst initially of just one major storm. We would say, okay, COVID-19 hit, it changed, it rattled our world. And now we're like, okay, what's happening? And then we begin to see and recognize more of the institutional racism becoming. And that was another storm that hit. And then we begin the home, having kids at home, not being able to connect. It hit. And that became a whole nother storm. Jobs became another storm. And so right now, we just want to acknowledge that it may feel like for a lot of adults and children that you're in the midst of a storm that doesn't seem like it's ever going to end. And a storm that creates so much uncertainty that it's really hard for you to plan for the next day, the next week, or the next hour. And so just acknowledging that in this time, we're sitting in uncertainty, we're sitting in the unknown, we're sitting in a place that creates perpetual anxiety. We're lacking connection that allows us to say, oh, I'm okay, or oh, I'm going to be okay. It's a time where a lot of our identities were tied to the things we were able to do. And so now, who are we? How are we going to decide who we are? How are we going to grow? What's next for us? And just also just really acknowledging that during this time, there's so much uncertainty that even the people we look to that should have answers for us, they're like, wait, I don't have the answers either. And they're like, you're gonna have to get back with me, right? So we're in a time where answers to questions aren't coming. We're in a time that consistency isn't there and present for us. Those benchmarkers that we use to bench out to mark our life, like the holidays, even like, oh, if I can just get to Thanksgiving, I know I'm gonna have a break and this is gonna be well. Or woo, the Christmas holidays is coming. Can't wait. I'm gonna hang out with my people. I'm gonna get my cup filled up. And even now we're being told that that's gonna be different. And so we're in a time that everything that was familiar is different. We're in a time where everyone wants to say the new normal, but I'm going to say, nope, it's not new, it's next. Because one day you feel like you got a routine, some other change happens, and you're going into a next normal. And so you're really sitting right now in a place of uncertainty. We are having uncertainty about our finances. We don't know what's going to cost, what's not going to cost, whether jobs are going to be stable. We're having insecurity also about like whether or not we're even going to get stuff from the grocery store. Right now, people are like, do I buy all the toilet tissue I can find? Do I buy all the paper towels I can find? You send messages, hey, I found wipes here. Did you find any over there? So we're really in this time that you don't know whether or not you need to hoard or wrap your arms around tight some things or let go. We're in a time where, the love and the hugs that you used to get from loved ones, you're not getting anymore. The smiles, even just going throughout your day, you're not seeing them anymore. So we're definitely in a context where care is really hard to be shown. So we want to acknowledge that.
I would also add that one of the things that Courtney is talking about is a phrase we've been using on the BRYT team is the chronic holding of the unknown, right? There's an ambiguous quality to our situation. That's part of what makes it really hard, right? Like as human beings, we're not great at actually dealing with ambiguity. We'll take a risk, a calculated risk over ambiguity, because at least then we can make an informed decision, right? But every day feels a little bit new and a little bit different, and also really static at the same time. It's this very incongruent experience where it's hard to wrap our head around the fact that nothing's changing and yet everything's changed. And so I just want to also name that ambiguity is a quality we're not used to experiencing with so much persistence, with so much chronicity at this point.
Sorry about that. Thank you for that introduction. And there's a number of pieces that I took from what Courtney and Sarah are saying. And I thought maybe I'd put some prompts out there for you to respond to, because these are some that I'm certainly receiving from families, as is, Faye Brady, who's in the green room here, our student service director, as well as principals and teachers and the other staff, what they're hearing about. And so, one of the ones that we hear a lot is, what would you say, what would you advise families or caregivers who are worried about their children's mental health, particularly with all the variables that you talked about, the uncertainty and the season? How would you support, or what advice would you give to caregivers in that way?
First of all, I'd say great job paying attention, first of all. I think if you're paying attention to your kid, you're wanting to notice if anything feels different. Courtney and I can certainly give you a list of things to kind of be on the lookout for. But one of the best things you can do is be honest with your kids and talk to them about what's going on. Tell them what the parameters are and why you're making some of the choices you're making. And be clear with them about what they can and what they can do, which is just as important as what they can't do. Sometimes we can get, as parents, I'm speaking for myself a little here, it's easy for me like to say, don't do this and don't do that. And I have to remind myself to say like, yes, you can go do this and yes, you can go do that. And at a time when there seem to be so many strictures on everything, like it's really important to make sure we slip in the cans. But a great resource, and I'm happy to provide this link to Mike afterwards, is the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. They have some great resources for parents on how to talk to your kids about what's happening and, you know, washing hands and wearing masks and when to do that and why to do that. And to contextualize it in a way that doesn't feel traumatizing, but is really direct and informative.
I would say one of the things that's really important during that time is to not be afraid to talk to your kids about the effect that the virus is having on them, right? And to talk to them about the things that they feel like they've lost because they're grieving a sense of normalcy, some of them a sense of connection. And so acknowledging that there was a loss, but also as you acknowledge the loss, think about what opportunities are available for them now. Like, what are new things that they can do that you all can do together as a family that they can look forward to? Beginning to have conversations with them about, okay, now there's a lot of stuff that's out of our control that we can't control. There's so many things out of our control, but within our sphere of influence, what are the things that we can control? So it could be you're going to take and we're going to enjoy ourselves for 30 minutes a day. And we're going to move our bodies and we're going to dance and we're going to listen to our favorite songs. We're going to have the house dance party or the house dance off. You can even say things like, you know what, for 30 minutes, we're going to do mindfulness. I'm going to play some music or even go on Fire Stick and go to the relax channel. And I'm just going to play something for us to be still. And in that stillness, when kids are having a hard time, you can do something like ask them, okay, now what I want you to do as you listen, I want you to tell me, what are 5 things you can hear? What are 4 things you can see? What are 3 things you can smell? What's something you can taste? And so doing things to help ground them and get them to be present versus constantly in their head. The other things that you can also do is setting up rituals and routines in your house. So, what are the things that we can do every morning to establish a sense of normalcy? And these are the things we're going to do, whether you're in person, whether you're partially at home, or whether you're at home, right? But you want to make sure that there is some ritual routine because normally, if they were going to school, we know what that routine is. Get your bag, get in the car, we're leaving at this time, we got to be out the house by this time. And that ritual routine is there. For kids, it really helps to have some sort of ritual and routine that starts their day and then something that ends their day at the same time. But as a family, even for adults, if you all could end the day doing something as a family, as a ritual routine, even ending the day with everyone just saying, what's something that we can be grateful for today? What's one thing that we are proud that we're being able to accomplish today? Right? So ending the day with a sense of gratitude versus everyone saying, I'm tired, this was different, I didn't like this, but really forcing the mind and the body to think about what was good and what we can control.
Thank you. I'm gonna mix in some questions that I'm seeing come through the chat with some other ones that are some of the frequently asked ones I referenced before. So we get a question, do you have any recommendations for shielding children from the constant talk about the virus, which seems to overshadow so much conversation? And I think that's true. I think we all experience that. And I think like many other challenging things, it's for families, and this is one I've heard a lot, how much to talk. I know some of this, and hopefully your recommendations talk a little about the age of children and developmentally where kids are. But you can't turn on the TV, even if you're watching another show, with seeing an ad for the news with some information about COVID-19 or vaccines, which might feel like good news to us adults who can make sense of it. For young children, they may not understand what that means. So, do you have any thoughts about how to help caregivers think about that and how to support them as they're working with their own children?
Yeah. So. I do think regardless, right? So kids are really sensitive. And I do think adults have a tendency to underestimate what kids are able to pick up on. And so what's really most important, if you have a kid who's verbal, so even as young as 3, right, we need to find language to talk about the virus to the children and to kids in a way that they're going to understand. And that language should be age appropriate. But it kind of ties back into what I was saying earlier, which is just, one of the best gifts we can give our children around something like this, where there's so much uncertainty, is to answer as directly as possible in language that's appropriate. And to also acknowledge when we don't necessarily know or have an answer, because that's also okay, because that's reality. And so the CDC actually has some guidelines around that. They have a website that's devoted to talking to kids and also engaging with kids. And I do believe I saw some information on there when I was checking it or updating it earlier about language you might use with kids. But I do think the other thing that's totally appropriate is really limiting how much talk there is around the virus, right? So the thing we focus on always gets bigger. And so the more we talk about the virus, the more it's on our mind. And so it's appropriate to talk about it. And also in the same way that you wouldn't let your kids watch certain TV or certain movies or even play certain video games, putting time limits on things, and making sure that certain conversations, adult conversations about decision making, maybe don't happen in front of the kids. It's important to monitor or put timelines on those things, while also still making sure that they feel informed, because that gives them a sense of control and agency even for little ones is super, super important.
I think one of the things that has been helpful for some people right now is this idea, and Sarah kind of hit on it, is about boundaries. And so having boundaries around time, but also setting aside a time and saying, okay, we're going to allow ourselves to talk about this at this time for 30 minutes during the week. And so you can ask all the questions you want. We can watch the shows, we can take in the news. And then after that, we're going to try to focus on other things that are happening in the world and in our lives and in our family. And so really using boundaries for that. I think when you think about different kids, the other thing to do is to kind of ask them, how do they feel when they hear certain words? And so for younger kids, you could do smiley faces and ask them to point out the emotions and really talk to them about what those emotions mean and how do they feel. For older kids, you can ask them more and they'll tell you, right? And so at that point, and really dealing with the feelings that are coming up for them, and acknowledging them and honoring them, not judging them and not trying to make them go away, but holding them, acknowledging them, and also making space for, let's maybe talk about this again, because it gives you a check-in point. If you're feeling this way now, like if we bring this up again in 1 to 2 weeks, are you seeing the same thing?
Can I just say, add a note for those of you with teenagers? Some of you may have teens who really readily talk to you. Some of you have teens who, when you ask them how they're doing, will constantly answer you with a 4-letter word like "I'm fine" or "I'm good" or "I'm okay." And part of the work in having a conversation with kids who answer us is to say, so what does that mean? I mean, okay could mean a lot of different things, and I know what okay is for me, but what is it for you, right? So to dig a little bit deeper under the surface with language like that.
Great. Thank you I see there's a couple more questions. I'm going to mix the questions that come in and some of the ones that I collected beforehand, but please do use the chat feature. For those, I did not introduce that well, but in the lower right-hand corner of your screen, there should be a little cursor and you can type in a question and we'll see it. But another one that I'm getting a lot, and this came up, we recently surveyed families, and this concern came up pretty frequently across age level bands, which is, my kid is struggling to engage with schools and peers online. We're in a virtual environment in our district right now, doing distance learning. And so, what can families do? How can they support their children who are starting to disengage, or their disengagement is increasing over time, especially as they're able to be outside less often?
It's a great question. I guess I feel inclined to add some context a little bit beforehand, which is that, I think something we almost forget is that in-person schooling is so critical for social development, and not just like reading body cues, nonverbal communications, right? Which, by the way, is incredibly hard to read over a screen, especially when all you're getting is this part of the nonverbal communication. And we really communicate with our whole bodies, right? We talk with our hands. When we move closer to someone, it means something. When we move farther away from someone, it means something, right? And so kids aren't getting some of that training remote, and that is likely contributing to some of the engagement issues, especially if with younger kids who are very much, still in the early stages of learning some of those social skills. And so some of that might be talking through their day and picking out certain pieces and really doing some of the social education with them around like, well, maybe this person thought that, right? And playing out scenarios with them so they gain some of those social skills. Or when you say to them, what could you say if this person, says or does something like that again, to really support them in learning some of the skills that otherwise they would be getting in person. I think another reality is just that being on a screen is tough for all of us. Zoom fatigue is a very, very real thing. It's not physically exhausting because you're sitting still, but it's actually exhausting because of what it requires of our attention and focus. And some kids struggle with that on a baseline level, but generally, especially our younger kids, like they need to be up and moving. That is why school tends to be highly interactive so that they can engage and move their bodies and retain their attention much better. So, that may be, if you notice a kid who's struggling to engage, that may mean connecting back to the teacher and really thinking about what movement breaks or other engagement tools they have in mind that might support your student in continuing to engage more regularly.
I would say the other thing, especially when you start thinking about teenagers and the peer group, they're missing out. Normally, when you sit in a class and everybody's doing work, you want to do work. You're not going to be the one that's not participating or not involved in a discussion. And so I think one of the things when you see lack of engagement, that's also lack of feeling like I'm a part of something, right? And so as much as you can help teenagers at this point when there's engagement to understand that they're a part of something, but also shifting the expectations for engagement. We're recognizing that, look, they might not be able to say, you know what, I'm engaged, I am a comment the entire class, but challenging them to say, look, can you say something in 3 of your classes today? Right? Like, can you just say, you know what, can you tell me 3 things you said in class today, in one class? Or even getting them to say, you know what, it's hard for you to do everything. What if you do for the next 30 minutes, you just commit to focusing on this thing? So it's almost as if you're telling yourself, you know what, it's hard for sustained engagement. So let's try to do smaller chunks and then increase that as you go along. I think the other thing that's important to acknowledge is normally if they're in the classroom or they're with their group, they're getting feedback on their responses, and that feeds self-efficacy, that feeds pride, that lets me want to keep going. And so when you're not getting that, then you're like, how do I get this internal motivation to do it? And so really asking them and inquiring about, right now, the only thing they can think about is what they're in right now. So everyone is very now focused. And so if you can tap into some of that, what do you want to do when you finish? Because I know this isn't where you want to end, right? And so really tapping into, okay, let's put that goal on the wall. Let me do things to remind you of where you're trying to go. And so you can help them get some of that internal motivation that's focused on external goals or external objectives that they want to achieve.
Can I just add one more thing, Mike? So some information came out probably 6 to 8 weeks ago at this rate, and it was a study done, and it was asking kids what felt most important. And the thing that they ranked highest on was peer connection. And kids are just really, really grieving the loss of that right now. And so two practical thoughts is that, as parents is, how do you facilitate peer connection, but in a really safe way so that, that we're not spreading the virus. And so in all the ways that you can do that, if that's a viable option for your family, if you're not concerned about someone in the home who is, immunocompromised, then playing outdoors with masks, is actually super important for your kids. And, and make them wear a lot of layers the colder it gets. Being outside is actually proven to support like the release of oxytocin and endorphins, and it just feels good to us. And so it may be something new and really different, but that is a really practical thing. I think the other thing is, this is where kind of connecting with the school and checking in with, a homeroom teacher or an advisory leader, or to see what ways is the school able to support students in connecting in a social way, or even in a reflective way, something that's more meaningful, so that they feel like they're checking in with each other as opposed to on display, which is how a lot of kids feel when they're on Zoom, right? It's this experience, of standing at the center, at the front of the room, all period long. That's what it feels like to a lot of kids. And so if we can move them back into their so-called seats, and connect as they would, that will also make a difference in them feeling connected and engaged.
Yeah, thank you. It's been written about a lot lately, the Scandinavian expression. I think there's no bad weather, only bad clothing. I'm not saying I personally subscribe to that notion. I think it's on Courtney and Sarah earlier. I am someone who really enjoys the warmer side of the New England seasons. At the same time, I think what you said is true, that being outside, I mean, just even personal experience yesterday, it wasn't terrible, but it wasn't lovely, but getting outside for a long hike with kids and everything made a huge difference in everyone's mood. And it's not the same excitement you get when it's nice and warm or even crisp, but you get warmer and then the sun comes out. I mean, that wasn't the day it was. And the effect was still the same. I want to just put up a couple another questions that are planned for our district to have socially distant or non-academic opportunities for students to connect with each other or staff. That's more for me than for Courtney and Sarah, but I just want to say if there are ideas, Deborah, that you have or anybody has, please send them our way. I know that there has been some, between kind of theater department and athletics at the secondary level, we've had some opportunities like that. And so if people have ideas, please send them to me or your building principal, and we'll see what we can do to put something together, because I think it's really important for all the reasons that Sarah and Courtney just said. We'll do some thinking, but it's a great idea, and please share thoughts with us about how that might work. Another one, what about support for parents to learn self-regulation skills? This has an effect on our children. I'll say that this is another one that, thank you for asking it, but it's another one that comes up a lot, that people have said, since this is the most they're spending time with as a nuclear family, since their children were babies. And while that's wonderful in some ways, it also brings about challenges because that hasn't been our routine for a long, long time for many people. It's even just I was talking today to a parent who was talking about the concept of space and how different space in the home feels. They're very accustomed to their space in their home being unoccupied much of the day by everyone. And now it brings about some tensions about cleanliness and cleaning and laundry and dishes that didn't used to exist when those were much more less frequent issues in the past. So I think it's a great question about the self-regulation skills for adults, because I think that's the person who asked this question, that's right. That certainly has an effect on kids. So I'd love to hear any thoughts you all have about that.
The first thing I would say is, I'm going to say, we call it self-care, but I'm going to call it self-repair. Because the reason I say that is you wouldn't let your battery, once your battery gets low, you're finding the charger, you're plugging it in, you're making sure it's good. So don't do that to yourself. And so one of the things that's really important in that is how do I think about, what do I need to do to make sure I'm grounded? Because if I'm grounded, then the house will be grounded. And so really thinking about that. And one of the ways to do that is through boundaries. And so really being okay with saying, I'm going to take 30 minutes by myself and it's okay. And, I have a mom that used to say, I'm going in this bathroom. Don't knock on the door. Don't open it. And I will see you all when I get out. Right. And so that was her time. I don't even think she was in the bathtub half of the time. I just think she just was taking a moment from us. I think the other thing is recognizing a sphere of influence, focusing on what you can control versus what you can't. And as you think about more people being in the house, really say, what's the bare minimum of cleanliness in the house that I can be okay with? Because it might look different now versus what it looked like before.
And I just want to, oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to jump off on that. So moderation is this term that we have been talking about a lot on the BRYT team. And it is this idea that, and I just want to acknowledge, like, the idea of moderation really flies in the face of a lot of different cultural values, including some in this country that are about work harder and keep going and push through and, truck on and that kind of thing. And sometimes those serve us well and sometimes those don't. And so moderation is the capacity to kind of step back and say, I got to dial it back somewhere, right? This is overwhelming. It's too much. And recognize that there's a cost to that and that sometimes pushing through is actually not the answer because pushing through actually just makes it worse, right? And so to Courtney's point around like, let's be really thoughtful. Now that my college-age child is now back home, when we didn't expect her to be. And I also have my high schooler and a middle school and high schooler and maybe even potentially an elementary schooler in the house. I think definitions of cleanliness probably need to shift and change in order to accommodate the fact that there's a lot more people living there. And not only that, like there all the time, right? Like we're not getting the same breaks we used to like, it's not the same to just like run to the store to get something, right? Because a lot of folks are really trying to limit the amount of time they spend in public spaces. And so moderation is really a critical component of maintaining resilience in the face of kind of persistent, uncontrollable stress, right? Kind of like the pandemic is putting on us, right? Because we don't have any control over it and we don't know when it's going to end. And so, it's important to kind of curb our impulses towards like just pushing and working harder. That's really not the answer in the face of this kind of stress. We gotta be a little gentler with ourselves. We gotta offer grace to the people around us, which is space and compassion, and give that to ourselves as well. Take a minute and say, I just need to take a breather. And I'm going to step out of this room and I need nobody to talk to me for the next 5 minutes so I can just gather myself. And that's okay.
And I think the other thing would be extending self-compassion to yourself. I think a lot of times what we expected of ourselves as parents and as adults, what we've been able to balance, the multiple hats we've been wearing and how we've been able to show up for them. A lot of times now with the added stress, we're not showing up in the same ways, but we're still trying to show up in the same way. So we're not giving ourselves permission to understand like my best right now can look different than my best was this time last year. And so as an adult, that's one of the things that's even important for you and your kid, recognizing that our best this time last year and our best this time this year is going to look really different. Putting on the pearls, getting dressed and not having pajama pants on is amazing, right? And so just getting to a place that you're recognizing that your best can look different right now. And I think as you think about regulation, one of the most important things is how to think about what is a way that you can be creative for at least 15 minutes a day. Because there are studies that have shown that if you can tap into creativity, you can decrease the way stress is experiencing you. It could be through coloring. It could be having a puzzle. There's a household I know that they leave a puzzle on the table. So everybody in the family just comes by and tries to put the puzzle together, and they keep doing that. But that's a way for them to be present and to feel a part and connected, and to also be creative because it forces them to come outside their head. You know, thinking about what are extra hobbies? Do you want people, since we're not seeing each other, are we going to make gifts for everybody this year instead of buying something? Right? Are we gonna and that is another way to engage in collective care. What do you want to make for your friends? What could you send your friends, or what could we send them to tell them we're thinking about them and we want to care for them? You know, do we want to bake cookies and leave them on somebody's porch? You know, like, what are the little things that you can do to tap into that creative side will definitely decrease your stress, and it'll decrease your child's stress. And again, just taking moments to breathe throughout the day. I have a friend that has said, Courtney, I tell my kid, if we can get to 140, we're good. So the kid knows if we get to 140, we're good. You know, the rest of the day, I can lay in the chair, I can not look at the camera, but I gotta get to this time of the day. And so even extending that grace and being able to do that is really important.
Great, thank you. Faye Brady talked about a prompt that she hears a lot from families that kind of goes like this. As a caregiver, during this time of social isolation, anxiety, and depression, will that have this time and all its challenges having a lasting impact on my child or myself? And what could I help to make this not so devastating for us, not just in the short term, but really the focus on long-term implications of the challenges of this moment?
You know, I think we sometimes have this tendency to believe that people are inherently resilient. And they're not. We're not born with resilience. But the great news is that we can cultivate it, right? It is actually a skill set that we can develop and work on. And so I think my immediate thought or answer to the question is that yes and no. I mean, the truth is, I don't think any of us will forget. Anyone who's been alive to live through this period of time will not forget it. But that doesn't have to be a bad thing, right? You know, life often hands us difficult tasks, difficult events, things that we have to survive. And that contributes to the fullness of our experience, right? I'll share with you something I often say to my clients, that life is not a feelings buffet, because if it was, we would walk up to the buffet and we would say, I would love a lot of happiness and a lot of joy and a dash of excitement and a little bit of surprise. But you know what? Let's take the anger and the grief and the disappointment and the loss, and let's just leave those over there, because I don't want any of that. But we don't have those choices. And in some ways, it's really important that we don't, because the breadth of that emotional experience is what gives us fullness, right? So to truly experience joy and happiness, you actually have to know their opposite, right? That's actually critical. So we want exposure to the full breadth of human emotion, but then we need the tools to manage the more difficult things, right? The more difficult emotions like grief and loss, sadness, anger, disappointment, frustration, right? And so that means allowing those feelings to exist, acknowledging that they exist, that they're human, setting parameters when they start to get a little bit hairy, you know. As I say to my kids, you know, you are allowed to be angry and you are allowed to tell me that you're angry. It's not okay for you to throw something across the room, right? So it's the both and, like, what is okay, and like where is the line? Where is that boundary? But I think going back to this idea of, you know, we all encounter hard things. What we have to do in the face of those hard things is actually to build our skills around resilience in the face of those. And those, you know, resilience is about connection to people around us. It is about creating predictability in our lives, and that's about, you know, helping to regulate our nervous system, which likes things nice and predictable. Right. So even if it feels rote, at least we know it's coming. Right. And that is soothing to our nervous system. it's about moderation. So it's gauging what we can tolerate and knowing that our best on a given day looks really different relative to the circumstances around us. And it means seeing where we have control and agency, and then really embracing that where and when we can, even if that means really shrinking the change to something small and very manageable, right? And again, on any given day, like, there's some days where I'm like, I can take on the world. And on other days, I'm like, I can clean the dishes in my sink, right? So, and that's okay either way. But we need to have enough of that self-compassion that Courtney was talking about to really give ourselves the spaces to live with that kind of flexibility.
And I would say the other thing that's important to remember is that in the midst of what we're focusing on, social isolation, anxiety, and depression, you can kind of moderate the effects of that if you can find something to look forward to. So even if the thing to look forward to is, oh, I baked this cake, I learned this new recipe, I cooked this new dish, right? Where you're not completely just focusing on those three things, then someone when they reflect back on the time and the experience, they're not just able to point to negative feelings and thoughts, but they're able to say in the midst of that, oh, I played this game with my family that was really fun and that was hilarious. Or, oh, I saw my mom do this and that was funny. So they're able to point to something. You all can point to something. Oh, we went for a hike. We would have never did that together, right? So you can point to what are some of the good things so that when they look back on this time, it's not just about the social isolation and the anxiety and depression, but they can point to moments of connection. They can point to moments of joy. They can point to moments of happiness that were created by making things happen, right? And so the thing is, it doesn't have to be as devastating. It can be uncomfortable, and we can acknowledge that this is an uncomfortable time, but let's reframe it as this is uncomfortable versus saying this is devastating. So even the language we use when we talk to ourselves and we talk to our kids can make a difference about how we experience it in our body. If I tell myself this is an uncomfortable time for me, I'm like, okay, I can grow from this. But if I say this is a devastating time for me, I lose my hope that there can be anything good that comes from this.
Thank you both. So I'm just looking at the clock, unfortunately, and if anyone has a question or two more, please put them in. I have one more that came to me. Also, we are planning this as a series, so if there are specific topics that, in the next version of this that you want to have, please do put them in the chat. But the last question that I collected beforehand, and you sort of addressed it, but I want to ask it a little bit differently, is, everyone seems overwhelmed. There's a feeling that there's nothing to look forward to, and the particular piece that's coming up recently is the advice not to travel for the holidays. And I'll say, for me, this is the first, my mother loves Thanksgiving, right? And this is always a holiday, and it's going to be really odd to not have that with my larger family who I haven't seen very much, at all. And I'm not alone in that. I think many people are going through sort of the awkwardness of the moment, and even try to do Zoom Thanksgivings or something, it's probably something we'll do for a bit, but we're not going to keep the cameras on, indefinitely and pretend to have turkey together. It's not going to be our thing. I'm not criticizing anyone else for doing that, but I think there's really a feeling as we head to the holidays, and these traditions or customs or norms that we have around family and seeing each other in celebration, particularly for people who don't live close to family, they aren't going to happen. And just anything you could do to, advice you'd give about how folks can take care of themselves during this holiday season.
I mean, first, I just want to normalize that it's a huge loss, and it's totally appropriate to have feelings of grief. I want to acknowledge some people might have feelings of relief at not having to go to what can sometimes be really interpersonally or challenging family get-togethers. So that I know that's not a consistent experience for everybody. But I'll be honest, I called my mom and my mother-in-law this weekend and said, we're not coming. And I cried a lot. And then I felt really, for myself, I felt really reassured this morning when I heard some of the news reports, and I said, we made a good decision. And that's not to say that anybody who's choosing to do differently, that it's a bad decision. Everyone's going to make their own choices. But for those of you who have decided to stay home, and that feels like a really big loss. Like, I think it's really important to name loss as loss, and that there's grief. There's a grief process with that. And that's, I think one thing we don't do terribly well all the time in this larger society is like acknowledge hard feelings, whether they're hard or uncomfortable or painful. And yet the only way through those kinds of feelings is to actually allow yourself to have them. So I think, acknowledging that that's what's happening, naming it for yourself and or for the folks around you. And then really kind of saying like, okay, and this is the decision we've made. And so how do you make it new? How do you plan something that is worth looking forward to? And it doesn't have to be fancy, right? Like, we're not talking about, going to extraordinary measures or anything. There was one Thanksgiving, and I've been thinking about replicating this for my kids, where my brothers and I, we like very spontaneously did a Thanksgiving Olympics on a local like jungle gym. It was one of the memories that came up for me the other day when I realized like I wasn't going to go home and see everyone. I was like, okay, like it's just quirky and it's fun, and like we'll get a kick out of it. And we'll probably remember this Thanksgiving because of something like that. So it can be simple and effective.
I would say it's definitely taking the time to, once you get through acknowledging the loss, right? Like, I'm thinking I'm going to miss grandma's sweet potato pies and homemade dressing, and, just the laughter in the home of everybody being there, right? And that sense of, I think when we say the holidays, regardless of whether it was with our birth family or our choice family, there's a sense of belonging that we're all missing, because we knew we had a place. Like, the holidays signified like you had a place to go to. So I think recreating and thinking about, well, how can I make this sense of belonging in this house, in the house where I am, or how can I make it in the community I am? And it could be creating a different type of ritual routine. It could be saying, the very people that I reached out to, what can I take this day and do something for them, and then put it in the mail. Right? It could be even just saying, we're going to come up with a dance. We're going to listen to music. We're going to have a music battle. I know one of the things that, as you're thinking about memories, is I remember the older people and the younger people in my family battled, like, who had the best music selection. So they were playing their songs and we were playing ours. And of course, theirs was better. But it was just having that moment where you're doing different things like that bring a sense of belonging and a sense of identity that people can be a part of. And I think it's prioritizing doing that, right? Because it's easy to sit in the grief and the loss. The hard part is almost like turning square wheels. It's trying to get your brain to turn over and to think about, how do I begin to think about, like, because you don't want to, you're like, no, I want to go back to what ended. I don't want to think about anything new. But being intentional and understanding in that intentionality about what I can do new, I build resilience for me and my family.
No, that's really helpful. Thank you. And I think that happened on a positive note for many families. I've got some young kids, who, for families who celebrate Halloween, one of the things I heard this year is people were really creative about how to do it. And most kids didn't miss the trick-or-treating part as long as the candy part came in, right? They figured out new ways to get their kids, my kids sugared up. And I think that's what we've always done, for many families who celebrate, the Halloween. And a lot of people are like, I don't want to go back. Right. Like we were able to create, new traditions, and it did work well. And so thank you for some of the hints and tips about that. We are at time. So I really want to thank all of you for the great questions and comments in the chat. Courtney and Sarah, you're wonderful as always. So thank you for being with us and sharing your knowledge and background, experience, and wisdom with us. And as I said, please do share, thoughts about a future topic that we want to do a series, and perhaps the next one might be more focused on a specific idea that we can dig into on a deeper level. But I learned a lot tonight, and really appreciate Courtney and Sarah and your work with us in the district. And thanks everybody for tuning in. Hope you have